So people online have been asking how I create my drums. Usually they'll ask about my process or if I bought a drum set online. I decided I'll start by fully explaining or trying to teach the remastering process that I've been using for years to get my percussion samples feeling just right, or how I want them. I'm an independent musician who has never paid for ads and never applied to be put on playlists. That, coupled with my genuine interest in audio engineering, has left me more seriously focused on music production and how to use audio processing tools since 2016. I've been using and learning how to use DAWs like Fruity Loops, Adobe Audition, and Audacity since I was maybe 11 years old. Digital audio workspace programs became a huge help when I began writing songs, playing in bands, and making beats in middle school. I encourage everyone with a genuine interest in making music to start now and to be confident. I've spent thousands of hours online learning mixing and mastering techniques through reading books, watching technically minded people mix and talk about music online, and alone through practice. This is why my music production style sounds or feels a little different from other musicians or bands. How the actual recording of a song sounds and feels is a huge part of why we react to music so emotionally the way that we do. Over the years, I've learned that writing songs using live instruments exclusively can only take us so far in our journey through artistic expression and in musical presentation. This is why at some point we will usually have to move our focus to music production and artistic stylization as independent artists and futuristic creators. These musical records, after being written and performed, are created by the restylization of recorded instruments through audio engineering tools like equalizers, compressors, noise-reducing dynamics compressors, and others. How we utilize these tools is up to us. How we get to the finish line as a creative, expressive person has everything to do with our natural and our learned preference as music lovers. Subscribe to my Patreon to watch this full mixing tutorial, and you'll have access to more upcoming videos on music production, raw and remastered sample packs that I created, demos, live stuff, and other pieces of my artistic research in music and history. My goal is to hit 100 Patreon followers by the end of this year. Through my Patreon, I'll be dedicating more time to teaching group-oriented music production classes. We'll also be releasing a quarterly compilation of music from artists involved with the school as well. I encourage everyone interested in making music independently to subscribe and be a part of this new community of inspired, creative, yet unorthodox thinkers. All right, let's start. For people still listening and wanting to learn more, please subscribe to my Patreon to watch the rest of this lecture and tutorial where I'll go into more specific detail outlining different techniques I created myself. Soon, you'll be able to create your own unique version of this pre-mastering process for percussion. I'd like to thank everyone so much for watching and thank you for your support. I'll see you soon. I want to start by showing people how I think about a song. I like to think of creating a recording of a composition as a challenge. In this challenge, my goal is to improve something I found unsatisfying in a recorded piece of music I made before, and improve my creative musical production process overall. I prefer a genuine process, and so I will begin outlining this process in as much detail as possible so that I can try to convey to people listening how many times I've done this and why I like to follow such an organized process. This is how I do my drums. So I'll usually start creating a song by writing drums, synthesizer, and bass. I might start writing a song in guitar, but creating a recording of that song will probably require drums. This is why I'll almost always start my process of creating a recording by creating a drum set. This drum set is built from an organized group of samples in the sequencer. I like to group these samples in a way that makes it easy for me to write chops as if I were a drummer sitting behind a drum set playing the pieces myself. When I start a song, I like to remember that the level of detail I want in the final mix begins here, at the very start, with this collection of samples and how I edit them to feel interesting. For me, getting a great sound at the very end with all of the instruments together begins with editing down the samples I use to create this drum set. Before I start a drum set that I'm building, I've learned to change the sounds I'm using first. First, I'll search for the samples I want and then group the similar samples together in the sequencer. Then, I'll rename and color code them in the sequencer so that I can keep the sequencer looking organized and therefore program beats more easily. I separate the samples in the sequencer list by drum set piece, and will usually place them in the sequencer by order of intensity or note velocity. For every drum set piece, I organize the individual samples from the most intensely played to the least intensely played. This helps me create and maintain a more humanized sense of playing when I write a drum part, or will allow me to more closely mimic a live performance by adding diversity of intensity to the drum strokes. How these different live drum notes affect the effect generating send channels and compressors helps to mimic the sound of a live drummer on a record in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. After I choose the samples I want to use, I'll make sure the sequencer is clean and organized, and then prepare to start my sample remastering process. I'm going to divide the drum sounds into different texture layers. I'll start by routing all alike samples to one source channel in the mixer. Grouping the kicks or snares together on one mixer channel allows me to organize the feeling of their output in a more uniform way. From here, I'll begin to split the percussion voice up in ways that make them sound interesting, feel satisfying, while making room for the melodic instruments by carving out unnecessary information. From what I've learned, using one EQ to split an instrument into frequency ranges that can be edited does not give me enough room to affect the most intricate details of the voice in the correct ways. To start, I use the mixer to make the sample groups in the sequencer behave like an input feed. Then I divide these feeds into texture layers based on character and edit these pieces to feel and behave differently using different tools. I don't think of these layers as pure frequency groups, but as layers of texture that give the percussion pieces character. This character is how we recognize different percussion voices. I intend to divide, properly, edit down, enhance, and then recombine these layers of character to remaster the original sample. Separating a sample this way allows me to bring out the best flavor in each texture layer. Giving the recorded samples more defining but recognizable character allows them to be heard in a mix without being obnoxiously loud. Our final mix is something we create using our imagination. Our imagination is going to be influenced by things we like that are learned and natural to ourselves. It is really important to use your imagination to tell you what to do next in this restylizing process. To emulate a live drum set being played using individual live drum samples, I intend to use the sequencer and mixer to model the sound of different microphones in a drum recording room. I imagine that sound by modeling my mix after a production style I know and recognize. I'll imagine the room microphone above the drum set and how it would change how we hear the drum set pieces. I'll use my imagination to create the input feed for the kick drum mic and snare drum mic and make sure they feel different from the overhead mic. This will be the final drum set. To get there, I need to create the clean drum samples that will be fed into these false mic sends later. These remastered samples will be put through effect channels, modeling these drum room mic inputs that I imagine. What I plan to do is create the most satisfying, realistic seeming drum samples while increasing their tolerable loudness. This will hopefully create a mix where the drums will be enjoyable at a low and high volume. This will make it easy to stylize other instruments in a similar way and proper ratio of loudness. For percussion, I aim to separate the instrument voice into texture layers using EQ. Usually I'll separate the percussion sound into sub-bass, punch, bass, pop, mids, click, and air. Then I'll soften the texture layers or make them more intense, depending on what I think they need, by running these different layers of the instrument's character into effects channels meant to stabilize and similarize the sound of the drums being played. After this, I can run all of the texture layers and effect feeds to a single channel and create a sum. This summation is meant to be a recreation of the original sample in a way that I prefer artistically. From here, I can run all of the different instrument voice sum channels to a final sum and create a complete drum set. Here, at this final sum channel, I will use multiband limiting to really turn the whole drum set up, and then I'll restart this process. Setting this process up is complicated, and improvising through the process can be a drain. What I plan to do is get to the final multiband limiting stage, turn the drum set way up, and then edit it again from the very start using the tools that are already in place. This allows me to try to counter the ways the limiter has distorted the low to high end ratio and signal overall. I love to use the multiband limiter as a kind of compressor or saturation tool, as qualities like priority and release can react in ways that affect phase and style of detail. This helps me get a nice, loud, full drum set that isn't overstimulating or take up the entire mix. Usually, after I get to this stage, I'll turn the signal way up so that I can more acutely affect detail at other points in the process. Then I'll clean up the sound, then I'll reduce the gain applied through the limiter. This can give me a softer, more stable sound overall. After this, I'll print loops or individual samples to begin the next stage of processing. Through this kind of process, I can apply similar or exact same effects to different drum texture layers, but in different ratio. This ratio difference in volume can help live drum samples feel more realistic or alive by implying distance from the receiving point and full room space. I'll sometimes use this process to help give synthesized electronic drum machine samples a more intriguing sense of character or change their personality and importance in the mix. How you choose to apply saturation, compression, reverb, or any effect anywhere is seriously up to you. This can be a part of the problem. What we choose to do to the percussion here will seriously change the aesthetic and mood of our overall mix through contrast. The sound we end up with is something that will come from our more subconscious musical influence if we are not focused and direct when building our sound. Because this revoicing can be something very simple, or be something strangely complicated on as many different levels as we would like as creators, I'll show you what I do. This way you can come up with your own ideas for what to do when you're starting a song project or digital workspace for composing. I intend to use these real live drum samples through saturation and reverb in order to model a more realistic texture, feeling, and sound. My concept for this production style comes from older styles that influenced me and newer production styles that I find unsatisfying musically. I intend to use real samples interacting with remastering tools in this way to create a more realistic performance from the sequencer playing the written pieces. This realistic sound is more deeply felt by the listener when I use samples and tools to recreate the impact, ring, and breath of drum set pieces in a space the listener can easily imagine themselves being in. Things we enjoy as music listeners give us ideas to emulate. I try to emulate what I think I would hear in real life or on a real record, but take it to the next level using my imagination. By using the drum set piece samples and the reverb voices they generate, I'll create a stereo space to fit the other instruments into. This is the drum room that I base my small showroom concept off of. I do this preliminary mastering process so that the other instruments have more room to poke through the drum set while they're feeling cozy alongside it. They'll be backed properly and feel more sturdy with and on top of the different texture layers of the drum set voices. This also lets me play and write instruments over programmed drums, but get into a little more. After remastering the samples, I sequence them one by one, print them, cut them out individually, and then restart the drum set over in another file after cleaning them up with fadeouts. After this, my drum set will mostly be processed. Now, I can focus more on the texture of the instruments and how they contrast against the percussion pieces in compression flavor, phase, relationship. Now, I can focus more on the texture of the instruments and how they contrast against the percussion pieces in compression flavor, phase relationship, etc. From here, I can take my drums to the next level in detail, make room for other detailed instrument recordings, and get a more accurate depiction of how the drums feel with other instruments. This is where I like to imagine my microphone channels. One is just above the snare and below the hi-hat. One is high above the drum set. The last one I'll imagine at either the front or the back of the kick drum. The last one I'll imagine either at the front of the kick drum or by the kick mallet and below the snare drum. I'll write a beat and use the combined sound of these remastered percussion samples playing together to create a live drum room sound from the interaction of these remastered samples with each other through effects generating send channels. This second stage is almost like the first stage, where I revised the live samples. I can stylize the sound of these false microphone inputs however I want, which can be part of what makes the process so complicated. For people still listening and wanting to learn more, please subscribe to my Patreon channel to watch the rest of this lecture and tutorial where I'll go into more specific detail outlining different techniques I created myself. Let me know in the comments if you learned anything new or want to try any of this stuff out. Please don't be afraid to try these techniques in your new mix projects and original songs as long as you are mindful with these music production tools. Soon, you'll be able to create your own unique version of this pre-mastering process for percussion. I'd like to thank everyone so much for watching and for your support. I'll see you soon. For people still listening and wanting to learn more, please subscribe to my Patreon to watch the rest of this lecture and tutorial, where I'll go into more specific detail outlining different techniques I created myself. Let me know in the comments if you learned anything new or want to try any of this stuff out. Please don't be afraid to try these techniques in your new mix projects and in original songs as long as you're mindful with these music production tools. Soon, you'll be able to create your own unique version of this pre-mastering process for percussion. I'd like to thank everyone so much for watching and thank you for your support. I'll see you soon. How we make the different